on behalf of the Urban Land Institute of Minnesota and welcoming Mr. Artsy Rybak Jr. So we're pretty multi-generational in this room, and I'm glad of that. So I'm not sure everyone has seen the Source TV show that we're talking about here. We switched it around a little bit, but did want to keep some of the essence of the program. So we're going to start out with some rapid fire questions. Okay. These are not a long answer question. We just want to know. What is your all-time favorite meal in Minneapolis?
Probably the first meal I had at the Midtown Global Market, which is one of my favorite places in the world.
What did you eat?
I think I had a Manny's torta. I might have had a hot Indian food. I might have gone to the place with the fresh meats and stuff. I'm trying to remember exactly, but I sure as heck remember the moment the Global Market opened. It was a big deal.
I love that. Are aliens real?
Yeah. The absurdity that somehow in the infinity of the universe there would not be something else is, of course there are. But I mean, look at the ocean, for instance, and there are all these creatures discovered all over. And I just read this book called An Immense World that was really about like how we as beings perceive differently than dogs and every other animal. And there's a lot more aliens we're not seeing in our midst too. So that's a longer story, but An Immense World is a great book.
Well, I love that
Yes.
you got my next question, which was the last book that you read. So
Not that. The last. I'm currently reading one called Jerusalem, which is just the history of Jerusalem, which is a really good book to be reading right now. But there was a book I read recently that I love called Civilizations, and it's an alternative history. Columbus comes over, but the indigenous people here had gotten steel from the Vikings, which allowed them to take over Columbus's boat and sail the other way and take over Europe. And it's a really good book to sort of, when you're looking at trying to unpack white supremacy and everything else, it kind of wound up being a better deal. So try that one out sometime.
I love that answer.
Yeah.
What pastime do you look forward to the most?
Gardening is definitely my thing. I am in a two-way dialogue with my garden every day, and so that's a big one. But I like cross-country skiing, I swim, I do all sorts of other things. But the garden's my deal.
This is a tricky one. Have you ever witnessed a miracle?
The fact that I'm here is a miracle, yeah.
I like that answer too. So let's get into some deeper questions, really setting the stage for early life. I had the benefit of doing a little research, but for those who don't know you, Artsy, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Minneapolis, where I've lived my whole life except for 4 years of college.
What's your family like, your parents and your siblings?
My father died when I was very little, and so I was raised by this really incredible single mom who never got to go to college, and so her whole thing was we would go to college, and so she helped put us through college and then went back and got her own college degree and a master's, and she became a person who put people, got hundreds of people into college, including herself and her kids and their grandkids. And so the work I've done, which is most important to me, work on career pathways, the Step Up Summer Job Program and all of that is really, I think, a legacy of my mom. I had an incredible mom. Then I have a brother and a sister, too.
What was Minneapolis like when you were a child? What do you remember of the city?
Well, you know, a lot of my life and why I do what I do is sort of tied up in the city. So like my parents met when my dad was running the Walgreens at 9th and Nicollet. And their whole life was downtown, all their services and stuff were. And so I grew up, downtown was very central. And then my mom had grown up outside of San Francisco, but she'd taken the bus often into San Francisco and taught us to take the bus downtown. So I'd come downtown, 8, 10 years old, and go to the YMCA. And then I was coming from this pretty much all white neighborhood in Southwest Minneapolis, and I'd meet kids from all different parts of the city and all different races, and that became a really great opportunity. My parents then had a drugstore at 26th and 4th, which is no longer there anymore. It was torn down for the freeway. But that was where the freeway is now. You hear a lot about Rondo and St. Paul being common ground, but 35W was too. So my parents were white people running a corner store. The two black doctors in town, Dr. Brown and Dr. Johnson, brought their prescriptions there. So we were a white family dependent on black customers, and there was more of an interrelation. When the freeway came and that was torn out, they moved to Chicago and Franklin, which at that point was deteriorating pretty quickly, and there was a large native population too. So I think all of that kind of began to give me a sense of what I think now we talk about where you sit on a continuum of privilege. I was going to Breck on a scholarship, so most of the kids were richer than me, and then at night we'd go to the drugstore and deliver prescriptions around Phillips, where I could walk up to the door and hand a prescription to a kid who looked like me, and their house looked a lot less than my house did. And so I think because of all of that, that's when I began to think I wanted to be mayor, and when I was really involved in cities, because I recognized that there were specific reasons why I had more or less than somebody else, and I saw the inequity pretty early.
Did you then go to college desiring to study that, or did you?
Yeah, 13 years old, I decided I wanted to be mayor. Watergate came along, and I saw the power of journalism. So I went to college thinking I want to go to another city I can learn from, so went to Boston College, and I want to study so I can come back and write about architecture and development for the Star Tribune and become mayor, and I did all of that. It was not that simple, but yeah, I was very, very planful. I was a terrible high school student, but I knew where I was going.
Did you play sports in high school?
Yeah, I played football and baseball.
Yeah, so you went to school in Boston. What was your first job out of college?
Editor of the St. Louis Park Sun, and then a year later I went to the Star Tribune, and the editor on my first day said, "What would you like to write about?" And I, of course, talked about I want to write about architecture and development, and I know a lot about politics, and I go on and on about all this stuff. And he said, "Is there anything you don't want to write about?" I said, "Yes, I will write about anything except crime." And the next day I was assigned to the crime beat. And so my job was every night to go out and write about the worst thing happening in the town that night, and write about it really fast. Like, you got to come back to the office, and in 10 minutes you got to file the story. So night after night after night after night, I was going in and seeing the other side of a city I love, and understanding how to talk to people who were in the most traumatic part of their day, life probably. And that was, you internalize a fair amount of trauma. It also taught me a lot about empathy and about how to just shut up and listen, which is not core to my personality, but a learned response. So years later, when I was door knocking, or more important, when I became mayor, I felt it was important to be present. So I went to murder scene after crime after others, and I knew how to do that, but I also think I had a lot of confidence that I could walk into that situation and be real. But I do think that wound up over a lot of time building a lot of trauma that I really had to get some therapy for, because when you're that present at that much violence and tough stuff, it takes a toll.
Yeah.
That's probably more than you wanted out of that answer, but
I love that answer.
Yeah.
Truthfully, I like to sort of break the wall that trauma doesn't exist for all of us. There are a lot of things that we're not used to talking about in professional settings or conversations like this. But the truth is, we all have those kinds of experiences. We all face really challenging moments. We all have to face moments when we need support or help to understand context, to maybe not keep deciding to have a very stressful life if it's not the right thing for us. So I appreciate that you mentioned it.
Yeah.
As you were working as a journalist, you talked about 2 different jobs there, but let's just frame the context of your 20s a little bit. Were you a journalist all of your 20s, or what else did you do as far as work in that period of
so
time?
I was a reporter, and I eventually got around to covering architecture and development as I wanted to, and city planning. And one of the projects I was covering was when the Mall of America was being built. And so I went up to Edmonton with the governor and all these people to cover this thing. And they were all, riding rides and stuff like that. And I snuck away to downtown Edmonton, which was a ghost town. And I thought, wow, this is really going to be awful for our city. So when you start to feel like that, you stop being a journalist and you start to have an opinion that, But so I wrote this article about what is the downtown response going to be. And during that time, a guy named Bob Dayton, who was head of the downtown council at that time, said, we need to do something about this. So why don't we create a job, an economic development job for you at the downtown council? So I did that for about 4 years. And then a couple of the projects I worked on were early on trying to figure out how to get Target to do a store downtown. So after a while, I went off to work at Eberhard to work on that project, and also an early iteration that developer Ray Harris was doing on what would have been a little more exciting Block E. And so that was really great, and worked on that for a while. Then I got a guy named John Pellegrin, who was this brilliant marketer who really built the Target brand, said, we just put our name on a basketball arena. And I said, that's the dumbest thing I have ever heard in my life. And he said, well, interesting, we want to hire a person to figure out what that means. So I said, well, I'm not looking for a job, but I'd like to start a marketing company. So that was my big client. So I worked on Target's relationship with Target Center and developed this ticket strategy here and nationally called Treat Seats, and did that for a while. And then I got approached by sorry, I've had 12 jobs. I'll try to do this quick. And then
don't go quick.
Then a pretty brilliant journalist named David Carr, who would go on to be a major player at the New York Times. Movies have been written about him and stuff. He was quite amazing, but he had just gone in to work at what was then a failing alternative weekly, the Twin Cities Reader. And he said, we need a publisher. So I really believe in journalism. I became the publisher, meaning running the business, while David, who was one of the most talented and explosive people I've ever met in my life, was the editor. And so we worked at that for a while. And then I got offered a job as vice president of something called Internet Broadcasting. I had not been on the internet at the time. The internet was brand new, and it was to marry TV and internet to create the visual and the depth of information. We did that for a while. Then I went out to be an internet strategist and helped explain this new technology to people, which makes me sound like an incredible dinosaur. I also remember when the first fax was out, so that's another story. But and then I ran for mayor, I guess, so it was the next thing.
Yeah, so I love that you really focused on what is the truth and creating that, publishing, a lot of economic development, a lot of where economic development meets physical space, which is obviously what those of us at the Urban Land Institute are especially interested in.
Yeah.
When and why did you know it was time to run for mayor?
I think my wife said, stop, if you're going to do this, stop talking about it and do it. She had been very resistant. We were both quite concerned that we had little kids at that time, and I really pretty much grew up without a father, and I wanted to really, really be a dad. So I was loving that, but sort of looked at the dynamics of the race, and I kept trying to encourage somebody else to run for mayor. And so the idea was I would run and lose and come back and win. Well, I won. And that was great. I wasn't, and our family wasn't prepared for that, but, and I was over my head immediately, but I figured it out.
I mean, I'd love to jump ahead to a question about being a father and a husband as well. How does that factor into purpose as you launched your way through your career and decided to do these big things? How did being a partner and a father create meaning for you?
Yeah. Well, a lot of all that mishigas of this job and that job was really about me trying to have a structure, including being self-employed, to be a better dad. So the mayor thing was, I remember right after I announced that I was running, laying in bed all night thinking, I've only done one thing perfectly well in my life. That's being a dad, and I'm about to mess that up. I didn't say what I was about to say. And what we decided is that quality time is kind of bull. You know, there is a quantity time, but there were a couple things. One is I would do everything I could to be present, but we would always have dinner together. So the whole time I was mayor, you know, 3 to 7 nights a week we were having dinner together and breakfast, and then maybe I'd go out to a community meeting, but I'd be back for bedtime and all that. And I basically had 2 jobs at that time. Our kids wound up both being extremely civic and political and about social contribution because they wound up seeing a lot of inequity, as I guess I did growing up, but they saw it like in a very real way. And they also saw like somebody who nobody knew winds up knocking on a bunch of doors and gets elected. So they had a fairly unusual view of what's possible, but it didn't mess up our family is the long point I'm trying to make, which is good.
Yeah, do you see that as, you know, balance, or do you see that as focusing on what mattered to you about family and work integration?
You know, balance is such a good question because it usually implies it's a zero-sum game. I will do less of this so that I can do that. I think this, unfortunately, was a more of more. Like, I was really doing a lot as mayor, and I was really doing a lot over here, and it was not, you know, like an easy lift. But I don't think balance is exactly the word, as much as do everything you possibly could to be a good mayor and do everything you possibly could to be a good dad. And I think I pulled that off as far as time goes, but it was a lot, you know.
You sort of famously say that being mayor was your dream job, you know, perfect fit for you. You also, while mayor, had to tackle, you know, big issues, rising crime, specifically youth crime, with the 35W bridge collapse.
Yep.
We also, as a state, legalized gay marriage. So you really sat at the helm of a city, you know, during very intersectional times as well. I have 2 questions for you.
Yeah.
Do you perceive that period of time as giving you energy, or as having been very tiring for how much you worked?
I definitely am one of those people who gets energy from being out there. I don't need to be around people all the time. In fact, I need time to come back, but I love the work. So I think the thing that was hardest for me, going back to the crime thing, you know, crime for me was, one of the very few memories I have of my father was when our drugstore was broken into and he had to go down and meet the police. And for some reason, I begged him, please let me come, please let me come. So finally, you know, I don't know, it was 5 maybe. So I go down with him to the drugstore and see the cops and see the look in my dad's face of what it meant that somebody had broken into his store and it was a big deal. So crime was always this thing for me that I wanted to get away from. And so now I was mayor and I'm in the middle of this, and the youth violence was really, really tough. And so there was, does the name Taisha Edwards mean anything to anyone? She was a 12-year-old girl who was doing her homework, and there was a gang battle outside, and a bullet came in and killed her. So I hear about this, I run to the hospital, I meet her family, and immediately the doctor comes out and says, your daughter is dead. And we kind of got swept up by accident. I wind up in this little tiny room with people who've just found that out. So like, what do you say? So I'm racking my brain, what do I say? Well, at that time, we had a 12-year-old girl at home, probably doing her homework. So I just tried to visualize what would it be like if that was Grace. And I sort of spoke to them through that. I can't remember everything I said, but a couple months later, there was a kid named Brian Cole who was playing basketball with friends and was in the wrong place at the wrong time. So my son played basketball with his friends all the time. I went back in, how would I feel like that? at the end of a summer that was very violent, I basically emotionally killed my kids many times. And to visualize in a way that could make me show up authentically. And so that was super hard. But the good news is during that time, and it's interesting we're here, because the Minneapolis Foundation and Ellen Luger at the General Mills Foundation came to me with this idea of a public health approach to youth violence prevention. And that basically means go upstream. And so we laid out this 20-point program with 4 main areas, got people in the community together, used what was the latest research, and over the next year and a half executed against every one of those things. Every young person surrounded by a trusted adult, intervene at the first sign of at-risk behavior, rejuvenate our kids. So then you ask, what's the first sign of at-risk behavior? And you realize it's curfew and truancy. We set up a curfew truancy center, et cetera. So we laid all that out, executed against it, stayed to the plan, and youth violence went down dramatically. And that was really rewarding to me because it felt so hopeless, and then it felt like if you can figure out a way to unite everybody, it works, which is why kind of I do this job, because it's all about 1 + 1 is 3. And I definitely believe that there's no one who can solve any single thing, and there's everyone who can solve everything. Whatever that means.
Some unbelievable things
Yeah.
you just shared. I'm really hearing the power of presence and empathy, dropping in at the heart level and letting that influence the decisions that you make and the things you choose to focus on so you can see those results. Wow. I appreciate you sharing that with us. To shift, to look at your life more broadly, we're talking now about the work you do here at the Minneapolis Foundation, how impactful that is, and why this is a dream job as well. How do you see your core focus now?
It's kind of funny to go from something that is very visible to not. And I go around town, it's sort of a strange thing, but I go around town and, people are very, very nice to me. Also, some people just sort of recognize me, but they're not sure. And the thing that so often comes out of their mouth is the weirdest thing is, didn't you used to be a weatherman? Like, not a current meteorologist, a washed-up weatherman. Okay, so, or people will say, oh, what's it like to be retired? And then I'll say I'm working at the Minneapolis Foundation. Sounds like this cute little retirement job where I come in and sit in the corner and tell stories. No, this is like $1 billion organization. It is $100 million comes through here every year, primarily through individuals who open up their own charitable account. And then we grant dollars out as well. So it's a big operation. And we're doing some really big things. With our discretionary dollars, we focus on equity and justice in 3 areas: education, economic mobility, and the environment. So for instance, when George Floyd was murdered and big chunks of area burned, we put together a $50 million fund and invested up and down Lake Street and West Broadway, and the Coliseum building you'll see right over by the 3rd precinct is, we put a bunch of money into that, but small businesses up and down that street. Or we're part of the Groundbreak initiative that has pretty much every foundation and lending institution at one table looking at black business starts and home ownership. Or we just raised $1.5 million for literacy teachers in Minneapolis schools. And Monday we had a big convening on environment where we talked about a number of things, including the $40 million grant from the Environmental Protection Agency to do environmental justice. I'm also getting very involved in issues of downtown and hopefully increasingly uptown, trying to really go back to the city planning part of thing that I care about and build a stronger ecosystem of people who can implement the many visions people have.
What would you say motivates you?
Fear, I don't know. No, I don't know anything. What does motivate me? I, at a pretty early age, was more interested in place than thing. It was always Minneapolis to me. So, I've had opportunities. I had some really good opportunities when Obama was president because I was close to him. But I never, ever wanted to leave here. So I'm a little bit more about thinking that I want to leave it a better place than I want to do this one thing. Yeah.
What do you think are the major issues facing Minneapolis right now? I mean, I think you have unique perspective. You just ran through, a great list of focused projects, focused investments where you think there are issues and opportunities to make a difference in the Minneapolis Foundation. But how would you boil that down to just, a few major issues for our city right now?
Well, the areas we're working in education, economic mobility, and environment is a good start. But I think one of them is to really develop to stop thinking about the past and start thinking about the future. Like, I've told this story a lot, but I think to this crowd it's important that I spend a lot of time with people saying, oh, what's going on with downtown, and so worried and all that. The story I tell is going up to the top of this building in the mid-'80s with a visitor from outside of the city. Remember the glory days of downtown? So I'm all excited to show it off, and the guy looks out at the river, and it's all railroad tracks, and looks over at the Metrodome, and there's a bunch of parking lots, all of those parking lots. And over in the North Loop is a bunch of abandoned warehouses, and he turns back to me and says, where is it? Now, when you look at that today, we have definite complexity with office, the changes in office. I get it. But that riverfront, there are thousands and thousands of people living there with great vibrancy. North Loop, that's obvious what's going on there. East Town, and when we were building that football stadium, which was not my favorite thing to do, I did it because we could start a whole new part of town, and $2 billion of investment happened there, and Loring and others. Live, work, play villages now are all connected. So now what we don't have is 6 vital blocks surrounded by parking lots and railroad tracks. What we do have is what great cities have, a series of experiences and villages throughout this area. The core is an evolution to more of a live, work, play with a huge office population still here. And so I don't want to go back to the good old days. There's something very different and new out there. Stu and I were just talking about Uptown in a conversation today. There is tremendous opportunity in Uptown. And I think for all of the greatness of this city, it's like, get over it. Like, we're going somewhere else. We don't know where it is. The boat is out. It's not in the harbor. It's out in the ocean. We don't know where it's going to land, and that's a good thing. This has always been a forward-looking city. This has always been a city that's got capacity to do great things. And I think the biggest issue here with city building is that there is not the metropolitan consensus I see other places to really rally around the core. And I spent some time in Detroit a couple weeks ago. I'm walking around, and Detroit's got like much bigger issues, but the whole community and the state is focused on, let's make this a great downtown. And there is a really disturbing thing of people saying, oh, I talked to my neighbor, and my neighbor said don't go downtown, so I'm not going downtown. Get off the friggin' couch and come join us in the new downtown, the new uptown. Think about this. Downtown and uptown, because of what I described, I lived in uptown for many years and still live right near it. That was kind of the only neighborhood node going. Both downtown and uptown now are part of much more vibrant city that is not all or nothing. That's just a different version of things. Let's embrace that. And city building is not a spectator sport. And I was having a conversation with a guy named Tim Welsh yesterday who has done phenomenal work. He just left US Bank, he started Itasca, Greater MSP, he's done great work. And we were talking about this phenomenon of people expecting other people to do things. And the ecosystem of the city used to be 5 white guys with their name on a company doing really great things for the city, disappearing into the Minneapolis Club and planning the future. I appreciate what they did, but I don't want to live in that. I want to be in a city where everybody is mobilized. And I think a lot of people need to get the hell off the couch and get into the game. And that doesn't mean you have to like change the world. It means just join us in doing any of these things. And don't necessarily look to other people for guidance. We put out a huge report on what to do with downtown. I think we need a similar thing in uptown, all of that, so people have things to grab onto. But there is too much passivity in city building and expectation that somebody else is going to solve that. And that is not what the world is today. And I'm fine with it. That's a better thing than it used to be. Sorry, I don't even know what question I was ranting about, but my wife won't go to dinner parties with me anymore because I give people this lecture to get the hell off the couch, and on the way home she said, "We will have no friends left if you don't stop this." But
I think that's the
yes,
exact call to action we need, and why we're launching this series, frankly. Not so that we can all go forge the path you forged, RT, but that we can listen to ourselves, listen to our calls to action in our lives to show up to lead in the ways we're called to.
Yeah.
And I think our mindsets are very powerful if we continue to tell ourselves the same thing, i.e. downtown's unsafe and it's a bad place to go. We shouldn't be surprised if that's what we see. You know, the things we look for are going to reinforce what we're telling ourselves.
Yeah.
How do you relate to mindset? Do you have any practices, wellness practices, things that you do to stay clear-headed?
Yeah. All right, I'll tell this. Well, I had mentioned pretty quickly that I wound up internalizing a lot of trauma in my mayor job especially. And so I did this, what's called EMDR therapy. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it's, yeah, exactly. And so it's really trying to rewire what narratives you build in your own head, I guess. And I was carrying a lot of stuff and regret and all that. But a friend of mine, when she was dying, gave me a children's book that ended with these animals and person taking a trip, and at the end it said the end, and then it crossed it out and said, "Look how far we've come," which was really great because I really missed and regretted losing her, and I really started leaning into look how far we've come. Look at all the stuff I got from her. Then I started applying that to my life, where regret or any of these things that come up, or I said something to somebody 30 years ago that I'm still feeling guilty about. Now I think I wouldn't do that now. Look how far I've come from that person to this person. So I think that's one of the things I do, is to really focus on that.
Yeah, I would call that a mantra too.
I can't believe I'm like blabbing all this stuff, but go ahead.
Good, yeah. You know, again, these are the things we don't often talk about, right? You know, the core principles and values that we hold that help us stay oriented, our true North Stars. But ultimately, we're making decisions from that place every day.
Yeah.
So it's helpful to kind of lower the veil and talk about it. So I'm going to ask you some more weird questions. Have you ever experienced imposter syndrome? If so, how did you move through that?
Well, I mean, getting elected mayor was like, what am I doing here? And you know, the first week after I got elected, I hadn't taken office yet. They explained the budget to me, and the city was in huge financial issues. And day after day, I was getting briefed on all these horrible things. And then finally, at the end of one day, somebody comes in and says, "I don't know if you know this, but in really heavy rains, raw sewage goes into the Mississippi." And I'm like, great. So, you know, I was like way over my head. And so I thought, the one thing I can do is show up. That's where I got into all of this kind of stuff. And the second thing I can do is I used to be a reporter. So I can basically report and understand what's going on. And so I tried to do those things. But I also came to the conclusion, everybody's an imposter. I mean, it's like the grown-ups, the inmates are in charge, you know. Once you sort of demystify everybody, it means that you're not as much of an imposter. So yeah, I have imposter syndrome at this very moment, but yeah, I think people are really not that self-aware if they don't have imposter syndrome at some point.
I have these moments when we wonder if we can do all the things that we're endeavoring to do.
Yeah.
To ask another tricky one, have you ever in personal life or work found yourself facing something that felt insurmountable, i.e., I don't know how or if I can get through this?
Yeah.
If so, again, what kinds of things ended up helping you move through that season when you look back?
Well, I think the biggest in my working career is kids are killing kids, and I don't know what the hell to do. The answer to that was to figure out what the hell to do, and this youth violence prevention thing. So that was probably, out of any professional time where I felt that I was inadequate, it was definitely that. I am in charge of a place where kids are killing kids, and I can't stop it. But there are so many things that have seemed insurmountable. Well, I remember I just decided way early that I thought Barack Obama should be president. And it was an absurd thought. And, I'm walking around Iowa with this brochure for this guy named Barack Obama, and I'm walking up into these little tiny towns where I'm telling you nobody looked like Barack Obama, and they sure didn't have a name like him. And I didn't get the middle name of Hussein part. And but that happened, and I could only do that because I'd had the same time as mayor. Like, there was no chance I was going to get elected. I actually, who George Latimer was? He was the mayor of St. Paul. Okay, he was the best mayor in the history of Minnesota. So I really wanted him to support me in the worst way. So I go over to his office, and I'll tell him all how I'm going to be mayor of Minneapolis and all this kind of stuff. And he said, why in the world do you think you could get elected mayor? And he went on about, not just a little, but like about how I was definitely not the right person. And then he finishes with, and your face is kind of shiny. I still don't know what that meant. But I was crushed because this guy who I idolized just totally blew me off. And that seemed very insurmountable, but I just, I don't know, and that you get one little success, somebody says something and somebody says something else. And I do think there's a gift of delusion sometimes where you sometimes can hear that. You can have all of these rejections and negative things. Then somebody says this one thing. You say, yeah, people are about even on this, And I think that's helped me sometimes.
I'll ask you one more question, and then we'll turn it to the audience to see what questions you guys have as well. Looking back over decades, what incremental choices over time would you say have had the greatest impact on your life, direction, joy, and impact?
I think there are a couple things that are counter to how I'm wired that I have done increasingly over time. One is, I think by nature I want to jump up and do something, and I recognize the training I had as a journalist helps me slow down, get peace, and listen better. And then increasingly over time, as far as leadership goes, I've increasingly recognized that there's a very different way to lead, especially as a white man in his 60s who's had a big fat title walking into a community foundation that it's about equity. I've done a lot of work to flatten this organization and to especially build up the middle and upper levels, not way up levels, but the implementation stars who actually get shit done. Can I say that? I'm not sure. Get stuff done. And so a lot of times in our work, somebody else is leading and I work for them, which sounds like, one of these cutesy things CEOs say, oh, really, I work for them. That's baloney for a lot of people. It's actually quite true here. And that's been really good. We've had much less turnover. We've had much more satisfaction, I think, and we've grown talented people into much higher levels because we've stripped away a lot of the things that stopped them from rising and have also turned an organization that I think at first had every single issue coming to the top. Now, basically, the mantra is solve everything you can possibly solve, and if you get that done, I'll give you some strategy up here. but go solve it, And that is not by nature where I'm at, as somebody who jumps up and wants to solve everything and everybody's problems, but it's working, I think. Maya, are you here? Is it working? I don't know.
Yeah. Sounds like a really effective organization, very focused. I'll ask you more.
We're working on it, but don't set us up.
This is my selfish question. How can we support you, RT? How can we support the work you're doing
I want
here?
every single person in this room to get involved in downtown and uptown and not ask people for permission to do that. I want everybody to focus on schools right now in a big, big way. Certainly voting for the referendum in Minnesota, and I just think people shouldn't accept mediocrity. How's that?
I love that. And we'll turn it over now to the audience.
Well, first off, thank you so much, RT. That was a really amazing conversation to hear.
I'm not sure what I said, but
well, it was. I loved it. I looked at Emily about 10 times, like shaking my head. So, but my question is, we're obviously have a huge election coming up, and I just feel like we are just in like such crazy polarizing times. And, for us all to unite, like you kept talking about, like we all need to come together. We all need to step up, and obviously that change like begins at home. So what advice would you give to all of us to decrease that polarity and decrease this like right, wrong mentality, left, right mentality so that we can actually come together and solve the issues we're facing as a city, a country, a world?
Well, first off, I think it's to focus on there are a lot of things working and a lot of good happening. And what I love about the work I do is I'm in that a lot. The second part is, I guess it's probably not a surprise to anyone where I come down politically, but I don't see this as a political point. When we talk about, gee, the right and the left are doing this and that and it's equal, that's not the case. A portion of the Republican Party has chosen to try to create chaos and division in the country. It is being fed by the Russian government, the Iranian government, and the Chinese government. I think people are getting duped in a big way and are creating a false equivalency that is highly dangerous. So, there's wonderful stuff going on and we ought to do it, but there is an actual campaign from both within this country and without this country to sow division in this country. So learn where you can build a bridge with somebody else, but don't accept the idea that it's coming from all over the place. I'm not saying everybody is good or bad on some ways, but I do believe that Donald Trump has been a deeply, deeply destructive person for our country. And I'm not going to give you any sort of false equivalency on that.
Yeah. So to me, a key part of leadership is building consensus. So what are some strategies that you've used? Because obviously you've been in situations with people who have vastly different opinions. So what are some strategies you use to, I know you can't always bring everyone to the same opinion, but you can get people working together to move in the right direction.
Yeah, I think it's really important to try to do the exercise of how can I be the best supporting actor in somebody else's movie? And I'm very proud of the fact that every single council member who worked with me in my 12 years as mayor supported me on one major issue and opposed me on one major issue. I never had like a block of you guys are with me all the time and are not with me all the time. I really am proud of that because basically what it meant was we had a climate that said, I'm not going to freak out if you disagree with me and I'm going to come back. And that was a two-way deal. And so I think that's a really important part of that when you center yourself in a solution, as opposed to what does that person want, then you start to lose the battle. That doesn't mean you shouldn't play a larger role than other people sometimes, but if the idea is how do I get people to my opinion, as opposed to what are the facts here and what part of that do they get and how can I help solve their part, it makes it easier to get that one. So for instance, council members would sometimes come to me with ideas I disagreed with or might be kind of nutty, I thought, or something like that. And I'd walk through that. If I really concluded I couldn't do that, I'd try to figure out what are they getting at and what part of that can I buy into. And there's no real magic to that, but I think if you understand people's motivations, you can understand their policy easier, I guess.
We talked a bit about Minneapolis, but also you've gotten to watch, you've grown alongside this city over time. You've seen policy work, not work, things play out. We can't always even understand what's going to all evolve relative to technology and human evolution.
Yeah.
So imagine 100 years from now, what do you think are those 3 major trends that will have played out that you think you'd be
In
like,
Minneapolis?
wow? You can take that more broadly
Yeah.
or tie it right to Minneapolis as you see
Okay.
those affect us
Yeah,
here.
I would say that over the next decade, and certainly accelerating over 100 years, Minneapolis has the potential to have the most global workforce of most American cities, because we have this huge infrastructure of humanitarian organizations that have made resettlement really relatively strong here. And so our diversity is more diverse than the diversity of most other places. So the workforce we have speaks all these languages, understands all these cultures in a world where global fluency means a lot. And by the way, when I say global fluency, that sometimes means in your own country. You can't work at Target or Best Buy or any of your places without understanding how to relate to people different than you. And walk down the street, go to Bede-Makaska at sunset. See, this is a place where actually, with all of its wild imperfections, there's actually something happening here that has the potential to be really great. I also hope that we really have, the greatest natural urban environment of any city in the country. And I like to think we'll be able to show people that we've protected it and made it better, So,
Thank you.
yeah.
Everyone, I really appreciate all of you being here today, and RT for kicking off this series with us. It's not easy to sit up in front of a bunch of people and answer really vulnerable questions, but I think there's so much merit to doing so, just like there's merit to standing up and leading in our lives, contributing, and bringing our whole selves online. So thank you all for being here, and I hope you stay to join us for a happy hour.
Could I give this just a quick
Yeah.
thank you? One of the things that makes this community is that there is, in the morning, in the afternoon, in the evening, there are people out there all the time doing what you're doing, as opposed to sitting on the couch. The simple act of coming together with people who you may or may not agree with, you may have a professional piece of it, is an end in itself. Community right now matters a lot toward that point about division, toward your point about who we listen to. Listen to each other. This group is so important because you're just connecting. And that's what we really need to do more than anything. So I'm really happy you're here, and thank you. Yeah.